This morning we have two special guests with us. That is Fiona Campbell, Head of CRM at Gymshark, and Colin Strong, Global Head of Behavioural Sciences at Ipsos Mori. So we're delighted to have them with us. I'll introduce them in a second. But just before then, if you have any questions throughout the session, please do add them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. We will come to that later when we have chatted about the topic. But if there's anything that Fiona says or Colin says or I say, please do add a question or challenge it or agree with it or whatever you like into that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So to introduce our guest this morning, Colin Strong is the Global Head of Behavioural Science at Ipsos, providing leadership on the application of the discipline to a wide range of client challenges. He has worked in the market research industry for most of his career using a psychology lens to develop his advice, and he's also an honorary professor of consumer and behavioural psychology at Nottingham University Business School, as well as a published author. So Colin, thank you for joining us. And we also have Fiona here, Fiona Campbell, who has over 10 years of global experience in consumer marketing, digital technology and transformations. She has built and led the CRM and Marketing Operations Centre of Excellence at DAZN, and has recently joined Gymshark, one of Britain's fastest growing clothing brands, to lead their CRM strategy and vision. And as always, her views are her own and not necessarily aligned with her organisation. So Colin and Fiona, thank you so much for joining us. It's really great to have you this morning.
Good to be here.
Yeah, looking forward to a good conversation.
Great, likewise. So as I mentioned earlier, this episode is our 5th episode of the Innovation Mindset series, which is our 2nd series of the Breakfast Club. We are talking about building the digital experience. And for those of you who have just joined us, I encourage you to put any questions you have into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens, and we'll come on to that later on. So just to introduce the topic a bit, in previous episodes of Chief Disruptor Breakfast Club, we have talked about how customer behaviour is changing rapidly in the last few months, but at the same time, 70% of customers actually want to see normal advertising and business as usual. So there's a tension there that businesses have to navigate between changing behaviour, but the desire for some semblance of normality. So to begin with, as we know, customer behaviours are changing. Colin, as part of your role, you look at these trends and these behaviours. Can you just give us some headlines over actually how customer behaviour has changed over the last 3 months? What behaviours you've seen emerging?
Sure. Yeah. I guess it's well, clearly we can all observe for ourselves the way in which behaviour has changed, and the way in which remember back where we were seeing mass sways of buying of additional products for the household, and we've seen a significant move to online. We have seen and driven, of course, by necessity, by sort of external factors. We've also seen a move to, in many cases, to perhaps more traditional brands and purchases, which is kind of to be expected and is relatively familiar in times of difficulty. I think the interesting thing is that it's trying to understand the underlying psychology on some of this, because perhaps it's useful to think about, look, why do we behave in the way in which we behave in normal times? And I guess we have a whole bunch of regular routines, habits, which we engage in, and those are, in a sense, we can think about those as a way in which we go about mastering our environment. They're a reflection of the way in which we've mastered our environment. We've worked out, what works for us, what doesn't work for us. Okay, that works, great. So I'll just carry on doing that, and that's great when everything remains the same. The problem is that when everything's changed, then we've mastered an environment which no longer exists. So essentially, what we're now in is a time where people are really starting to look at new behaviors and trying out new things. And it's a real sort of open space for brands to try and understand, well, look, what can we do? People are trying new things. How can we be part of that and be part of that journey alongside these customers and trying to work out what they want, how they want to do it, and be part of that conversation.
Mm-hmm. And with that, you just mentioned the underlying psychology there, and businesses needing to understand actually what's happening, and what's important to them. Can you just expand a little bit around, with the shift to online that we've seen, and the psychology there, with what the consumers are doing now? What is the psychology that businesses really need to be aware of right now?
I think the key thing is that people are just really having to do things often. Many consumers are having to do things for the first time in that online environment. So the key challenge for brands is perhaps thinking through how to onboard people effectively. And in a sense, of course, this is something which brands have been working on for a long time, and really have probably got reasonably good at. Obviously, there's probably a lot of people moving online that are maybe the hardest people to move online. If you haven't, for example, if you haven't started doing online banking now, then you're probably less sort of oriented to that digital environment than others who have come on board earlier. But nevertheless, my sense is that the mechanisms and processes and support systems are there, albeit condensed into a short period of time, which is undoubtedly caused some crunches for brands in that onboarding process. I think the bigger challenge is really, how do you keep people there in that environment once things start easing? Because clearly this is something which many organizations have been trying to do for long periods of time, and people will do that out of necessity. But if you don't manage that process, if you don't manage that sort of ongoing relationship effectively in that digital environment, then we're likely to see bounce back. If people are doing it because they have to do it rather than because they want to do it, or if they're doing it because they are perhaps not necessarily, if they're not necessarily enjoying it when they do it, and they'd much rather be doing stuff physically in branch, or if they don't necessarily see themselves as that kind of a person who sort of does things that way, these are all the sorts of things which need to be thought about in order to manage things in that digital environment moving forward. So I think we need to think about behavior and behavior change in two phases. There's the starting new behaviors, and often people will start new behaviors. In this instance, there's people are starting new behaviors because of external forces creating that sort of necessity. There's no option oftentimes other than to do that. And of course, so there's a starting behavior, and then there's maintaining behavior, and the issues around starting are very different to the issues around maintaining. I think also the other thing which we're seeing quite a lot clearly, and it's something which is very topical, is there's this tension between people protecting themselves and looking after themselves, which is obviously the first priority and is critically important, but also the desire to resume what we might want to call normal behavior, normal activity, and going out to shops and going out to public places and so on and so forth. And these are things that from our work, from our observations, people want to do both. People want to go out, and people want to adhere to protective guidelines, and the desire to do both is there, and so it creates this kind of tension that needs to be managed both by sort of public bodies and public health, but also by brands as well, helping to manage and facilitate that, and really understanding, well, what is it? What do people actually need in order to feel safe when they're out and about, when they're sort of resuming normal activities? And there's a whole bunch of very, very functional things which people are looking for in order to help them with that. They need to sort of feel like, understand the risks, feel okay about those risks, and understand how to manage them, understand what they need to do, feel confident about doing them, and get help in setting up new routines and new behaviours to manage this highly unusual environment which people are in. And that's just going to take time, but it also takes some real leadership as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's what you shared there about the different phases of behaviour change. I think that's something that it would be great to drill into a bit more later. And if people are joining us now and they missed the introduction, please do have questions for Colin in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens, because I think there's some really valuable stuff that you've shared there, and it would be good to get more into that later. Fiona, I'd love to come to you from just to respond to what Colin's kind of introduced and set the scene for there, in terms of how these behaviours are changing, and actually the real challenge is maintaining that behaviour for customers, not making it something that they feel they have to do, but something they actually want to do. So this episode is about digital experience, and I'd love to just get your thoughts on actually what does digital experience mean to you, and has it changed, just to bounce off what Colin said there about those behaviours.
Yeah, completely. I think from a digital experience standpoint, it is extremely important that, as Colin mentioned, that onboarding. How do we get customers onboarded to our brand and to understand what we are and what we believe in? I think it's quite easy to forget that possibly somebody just wanted a bag of flour, and where they purchased that bag of flour, we need to be able to delve into the reasons why did they come to us as a brand, and how can we build that relationship with them as a brand. An example I had previously was, I had purchased items online and I have been waiting 2 months for these items and they still have not arrived. Not the best experience from a customer standpoint. And what would have improved that is communications from that brand, that organization, to advise potentially why there's a hold up, what's wrong, is there anything that they can do for me. Those type of actions are really important during these times. There has been unprecedented, changes on what we do and what we have to deal with, supply chains, whatever it may be. But as a brand, we need to be the ones to communicate clearly and openly with our customers so that we can really manage their expectations of us. Also, looking at the likes of with Gymshark, for example, we don't necessarily have a high street presence. And we don't use traditional marketing. We focus very much on the use of social media and influencers, and we have a super engaged community of users that really help us define how we should be acting in these times. But as a brand, we've had to change slightly different as well. Even though we were 100% digital, you look at things like customers still wanted to experience the look and feel of clothing. Very difficult when in our world. And how can you give them access to that without them feeling that it is, I suppose, more difficult than them just walking into a store? So things like extended return policies. During this time, we extended it up to 120 days, which is extremely long. It obviously, because of the supply chain and couriers and how busy everybody was, but also the fact that customers were sitting at home more and purchasing more, that we were giving them the opportunity of that. Flexible payment methods, how do we get them to encourage them to purchase Colin touched on earlier, not everybody is comfortable to purchase in this way. And now they have been pushed into having to deal with this situation. So looking at being able to give them the best possible start on those experiences. So whether it be free returns, extended return policy, free shipping, what all of this builds into is that overall experience of dealing with the brand. And actually what you want is you want somebody to purchase from you, receive their goods in a timely manner, and if they're fit for purpose, great. If not, they can return them without any issues. And the customer feels like they are 100% satisfied. If that isn't the case, you tend to have an issue with, will they come back to you when things become a little bit more normal? And I think the example that I gave earlier was plants that I ordered online, which are 2 months late, nearly 2.5 months late. And I won't be purchasing online from that brand again in that organization. And it really does impact what you do as a customer. We need to be really focused on building that non-physical experience and driving the value to the customer. And that's not just the physical goods, that's the feeling of the brand, how we can evoke those emotional responses as well from customers.
Well, I think I know your answer to what I'm about to ask you, but in our digital trends report from this year, 2020, we asked businesses of all different industries and sizes about what their digital priorities are for this year, and overwhelmingly 69% said that improving customer experience and engagement was a very high priority in comparison to many of the other priorities, which were kind of high but not very high. So there was just across all industries unanimously that is really important. So Fiona, I'd love to get your thoughts on I think you would probably agree that that's still, it should be a priority, but is it actually? Are you seeing that in businesses and how they're responding to their customers now?
Yeah, I think in the current times it's hard to strip back the priorities, other than companies need to be there to support and understand their customers, and as best we possibly can in this uncertain time. There's no playbook for how a company can deal with the likes of this pandemic, but if you put your stakeholders at the heart of everything you do, you're not going to go far wrong. And that's both your internal and your external stakeholders. I think it's really important that that customer experience and that seamless, frictionless experience is absolutely a priority, but also the fact that from an internal standpoint, that we need to ensure that your staff are safe, and that, you know, the individuals who are delivering packages or working in warehouses, whatever that may be, that you have a duty of care, not just to the customers, but to those internal stakeholders. So that's where I would say, although the priority from a customer standpoint hasn't necessarily changed, if anything, it needs to become better so that you build that relationship so that they do return, and it's not just that they were pushed into purchasing due to the current situation, but also looking at your staff and ensuring that that duty of care is at a priority.
And Colin, what are your thoughts on that? Is it really still a priority for businesses?
Well, the great digital experience. Having a great digital experience, yeah, absolutely. I think the issue is that perhaps what's happening is that we're all having to do things which we were not necessarily expecting to do in a digital environment. So my children are being educated in an online environment, for example, to use a sort of quite an extreme example here. But perhaps also, just to go back to other, I have relatives who are having medical consultations with their GP via digital. So perhaps in a kind of public services sector, but also inevitably in a brand sector, we are seeing big shift in terms of, well, what kind of behaviors, what sort of activities will you actually do in an online environment? And so in a sense, it's like, well, how do you then respond to that? And what else? So as a brand, what else can you be doing? But also, how do you do that, and how do you bring people in there? And I guess one of the things we talk about quite often are what we call affordances. And what we mean by affordances is the way in which something has its sort of inherent properties, which makes some things easier and some things more difficult. So, for example, in a face-to-face environment, it's much easier to talk to people, engage with them around things like sort of low interest type products like insurance, for example. And so then the question then comes, if everybody is then moving out of that face-to-face environment into a digital environment, well, what happens? How are the affordances of the digital environment, meaning that it's going to be hard to then do those sorts of sales? And if it is going to be hard to do those sorts of sales, well, what do? Well, you've got options. You can either throw your hands up and just say, well, that's just too difficult, we'll just have to wait for everything to resolve. Or you can start thinking about, okay, well, what are the characteristics of that face-to-face environment which mean that, which facilitate, which afford those sorts of interactions, and then how can we meaningfully start translating that into a digital environment? So I think, so we talk a lot about behavior change, and for effective behavior change to take place, you really need effective diagnosis. So you can't, so rather than jumping to the solution of, okay, here's the sort of 6 golden rules for the digital experience, it's a bit more about, well, look, let's understand what sits underneath this particular behavior. Let's say buying insurance, and what might the barriers be? Well, we can understand that. If we can understand that in that sort of offline environment, then we can use the principles of that and then think, well, look, what are the levers in that digital environment which I can start using in order to be able to mitigate those barriers? How can I design that in that way? And I think that's our kind of perspective. You need to think about and I think this is what Fiona's saying. You need to think about the consumer and the consumers and the consumer perspective, the consumer psychology, and what the barriers are to the behavior which you're trying to facilitate. And then how do you go about designing that digital experience in order to be able to facilitate that? And that's the general kind of orientation, I think, which we take, is that understand the consumer in a kind of clear-headed way, and then translate that through into that brand, into the digital experience.
Definitely, and yeah, I would say so. And I think from what you've just explained, Colin, I think, Fiona, from what I've heard about what Gymshark has been doing, that's very much something that you guys have tried to create during lockdown. So I'd love to hear from the Gymshark perspective what initiatives you've put in place to kind of be responding to how those behaviours can be cultivated, and what lessons you've learned while we've been in lockdown.
Yeah, I think so. From our perspective, it was really trying to understand the root frustrations of our community. We have such a highly engaged community, and we exist to unite that community, that conditioning community. So we look to serve them, support them as best we possibly can. And in doing so, we were looking at trying to understand what their needs were from us as a company, but also just their needs in general during this time, to ease them through the pain of lockdown. We tried to focus our attention on bringing resources that we felt could bring value and help them and support them in their everyday. And in doing so, we started to define a clear content strategy of how do we communicate, what do we think is of value. So on, I suppose, the second week of lockdown, we initiated a daily communication to our existing customers to talk to them about a whole range of topics such as health, well-being, mindfulness, the scarcity of kettlebells, and this is ongoing even now, and we're seeing that the community are finding really great value from those communications, and a moment to be able to switch off and to look at something differently. How did we get that comm strategy? Well, we actually went out to the community and asked them, what do they want from us? What is that type of content that could help them? We know that, you know, one example is home workouts became such a big thing. When gyms shut down, everybody wanted to understand, how do I continue on my journey at home? And we were able to make some content that's available in our conditioning app for free. So we have resources available to our community to get them to continue on that journey. Mid probably lockdown, what we notice is I suppose the landscape is bombarded with home workouts, and how you can do home workouts at any time of day, live or on demand. And actually our community advises that they find it a really useful resource and they are still engaging with it, but there are other things that they want to know better. And it's examples like, how do you make protein-free snacks? How do they run better? How do they look after and condition their body if they're putting it under quite stressful conditions? We also looked at an amazing opportunity to give back. So we wanted to get our community involved in helping out, obviously, the heroes of the NHS. And we introduced the hashtag NHS Sweaty Selfie campaign, which raised money for the Birmingham Children and Women's Hospital. And it was an amazing initiative where we just had our community post-exercise. They uploaded a selfie of them sweaty after their exercise, and we as an organisation donated £5 for every selfie that was submitted. So we did set an ambitious target of 175k, which we surpassed, which was amazing. And it also gave, obviously, our community globally, people took part, wanted to give back, wanted to feel like they could help during this time. We all feel like, you know, we stand out at 8 o'clock and we used to clap. Is there anything else we can be doing? So that was quite a nice touch for us as well, to get involved in that. And then on the other side, again, to speak a little bit more about the internal side of operations, is how do you ensure that, you know, it's not just your customers that you are obviously looking after, it's your staff and their well-being and health. We're all working from home now in various different situations. How do we gain clarity and communication for them? How do we ensure that they understand that we as a business are here for them, and the resources that are available as well? So that really helped us get to a place where, with our community feeling like we were helping NHS, helping them on improving themselves, and also our staff looking like they could reach out if needs be. The narrative of what our community wanted to hear changed throughout that, and that was because, you know, we were all going through this I suppose uncertain time. Things and priorities do change, but we were in constant contact with them to get the understanding of what they wanted, and that's how we changed our approach. And we did so in a kind of agile way, so that we were able then to research our community, understand what they wanted, and adapt our approach to suit their needs. And we've had really, really positive feedback from the community based on that content that they receive, and how it gets them through and gives them something else to think about and focus on. And our engagement rates, even after, I think, you know, 10 eight to 10 weeks are phenomenal. So I think it's probably a really poignant thing is ask. You know, don't just assume that you know exactly what your customers want. Do reach out to them, do get that feedback, and do try to build that into your experience to help enrich, I suppose, their relationship with you as a.
Yeah, definitely. I think the really key things that have come out of this is that, you know, empathy and understanding your consumers and building that ongoing relationship with them and really responding to their frustrations. So thank you for sharing that, Fiona, and those lessons that you've learned over the last few months. I think we are it's about time that we move on to our Q&A. We've got a couple of questions coming through, but if anyone has questions that they would like to pose to either Fiona or Colin or both, then please do be adding them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens, and we will come on to those. So Fiona, we've got a question here for you from Steve Wright. So thank you, Steve, for this. He says, my daughter has had a great warranty experience with you only this week, Fiona. How do you balance the cost versus the customer experience benefits?
It's a really good point. So our philosophy is we do want people to experience the best of us as a brand. So being able to allow our customer support team to have that authority to be able to refund, reissue, constant upcycling as well of maybe goods that may be faulty. We allow that to happen purely because we know if you have a really good experience with us, the likelihood is, one, that you will get more engaged with our community. Two, obviously you will continue to be an active customer. But three, it's exactly moments like this is where your daughter has a network of friends and she will be very vocal on the experience she's had with us as a brand. The cost side of things, it does eventually work out. It is all built into the understanding and the model and the experience that we want to be able to deliver. But it's really important that when you unwrap your package that you're happy with it from day one. And if anything were to happen, that we are there for you as a brand, because we do want to provide the best possible service and product.
Thanks. And then Colin, we've got a question here for you, which is thinking about a bit after what's happening next. This question says, as consumers get more and more tired of virtual, how do you think that this will change how businesses should respond? Do you think digital, virtual, online fatigue is real?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that we all just know and experience that ourselves, and just understand the how the difference in feeling between a sort of physical interaction versus a virtual interaction is different, and you know, at the end of many of us spend our days sat in front of a laptop these days and feel slightly exhausted at the end of it. So I think there's no easy solution to this one. I feel as if we will and are creating new norms, new rituals, new ways of engaging in that digital environment. And I go back to this point about understanding how we need to rethink digital and how we perhaps need to design digital environments for things that perhaps we hadn't expected to use them for previously. And one of the things which we need to be thinking about, and we don't know where you know exactly how this current situation will unfold, but it may be that we are in front of our screens for a much longer period of time, and this may become a new normal, in which case we need to rethink about how do we design that experience what are the barriers to using this experience for more more human style relating? How can that be built into it? And I think we're seeing just informally the way in which we've all started doing that, you know, and with perhaps, you know, virtual coffee breaks and drinks and so on, and creating new sort of rituals and meanings around these sorts of points. And I think that the key for a brand is to look at that and learn from that and think, okay, how can we build that in? And by the sounds of Fiona and her community, that's the sort of thing which is already taking place. So how do you build a more human relating into that digital experience is going to be, I suspect, one of the key challenges that brands will face and need to address effectively to continue with their success.
And that idea of that empathy is something that we've explored in previous Breakfast Club episodes, actually, when we talked to Laurie Beck, who's the VP Consumer Insights at Coty, and she was talking about that a lot. So I think it's definitely something that is worth thinking about for businesses, and really building that into, like you say, Colin, how they respond at this time and continue to respond to their customers. I think we have time for one more question before we end the episode, and I will pose this to both of you. But so this question is asking, how might supply chains be hit even harder in the event of a second lockdown? So
I just genuinely think it's hard to know. Let's be honest. I think at this moment we've been probably quite lucky, but we know that things have slowed down. I think this week I went shopping. It's the first time in 10 weeks I've seen wholemeal flour on the shelf. So it's taken quite a significant period of time to be able to get goods back on shelves and get them back available for customers. Most organizations will have had obviously stock sitting, but when that's depleted, if there was another second wave and factories shut down and that logistics stop, then the likelihood is we're going to have another situation where we just can't get our hands on the goods that we want. Then we have to look for alternatives, or a bit like as Colin mentioned earlier, is the fact that when we were, you know, bulk buying, so then do we all go out and buy as much as we possibly can again to prevent that? Hopefully we've learned lessons from that, but it's going to be very difficult to manage that as a whole, to be very honest.
Yeah,
Colin, what are your thoughts?
I guess I just add to that from so I'm certainly not well qualified to talk about supply chains, but in terms of consumer behaviour, I think that we're going to have to get used to dealing with uncertainty, and consumers will get increasingly used to dealing with uncertainty. We've come from a world where things have been very clear, very certain, we're taken for granted sort of items on shelves and availability, and we're somewhat sort of disappointed or outraged when they're not there. And I think that actually, there's going to be some changing around on that front, and people starting to think about how do I navigate an uncertain world, and that is the unknown right now. I think that is uncertain in and of itself. But I think what a brand needs to do is to perhaps start trying to anticipate, as Fiona's suggesting, trying to anticipate, well, look, how are people going to behave in this world? What does uncertainty mean? How does that, for a consumer, how does that translate through to us and consumer behavior and the way in it will influence us? Will they then bulk buy? Will they rein everything in and save all their money and so on? I think reality is we don't know yet, and it will unfold over time.
Definitely. Well, I guess that's the joys of being in this time. No one really knows what's going to happen, and we're all trying to predict it.
Absolutely.
So that is sadly all we have time for today. I think the conversation could have continued, and definitely I'm sure will continue. And to anyone listening, if you have any more questions or thoughts, please do feel free to email them to marketing@nimbus90.com if you want to continue the conversation. Fiona and Colin, thank you so much for joining this morning. It's been really great to hear your thoughts and your lessons that you've learned during this time and the behaviours that you've seen. So I hope that it's been valuable for everyone listening, and thank you so much for joining us.